This week we're talking about textures and UV layouts. So now UVs are the coordinates we use on your textures, and they match up to the vertices on your model. We can move the UVs around like crazy and it's not going to change the shape of your model. It's only going to change the way the texture is projected onto that model. So now whether you're in Max or Maya, we're going to have some very similar options. So I'm just going to go over first kind of the theory, what do these mean, how do we use them, then I'll show you in Maya, and then I will show you in Max. So just to start off with, I'm going to just make a plane. So a plane is obviously our most basic shape. It's flat, even though it's in 3D. I'll just raise this above the grid. I like to think of this as a projector in a classroom. So if I were going to put a texture onto this, I can right mouse click and hold and assign new material. Blend again is shiny, Lambert is matte, so up to you whatever you are going for texture wise. But then I can go into my color. If you're in Max, it's going to be diffuse, but then I can grab a file. Now there's one that we're going to look at that's assigned in this lesson that's in Canvas or in Brightspace, but for now I'm going to show you this. So now when you're in Maya, if you put on a texture and you don't see it automatically, hit 6 on your keyboard and that's to show your texture. So just as a reference, I have a brick image here. You can see it's placed on here, yes, but does it look good? No. So that's because we haven't told Maya, hey, this is where I want this texture to sit and how I want it to be tiled and all of that. So I can go to UVs and I'm actually going to go to planar. Now Max has the same thing, and think of it again as a projector. I'm shining a 2D texture onto my 3D object. Now this works really well here because it's a flat surface. Now by default it doesn't look very good because the planar is actually facing the wrong way. You can always go in and hit the option box here and tell it what axis we're looking for. So project, now you can see with just the hit of a button it looks much nicer, right? When we first do the projection, you can see we've got these little boxes that we can click and drag. That allows us to scale and show how often our texture is tiled. Okay? So it's really important when you're dealing with your model, especially moving forward with your milestone, that if you're going to put a texture on it, you need to pay attention to scale. You know, let's say these bricks were huge, way too big. If I go to scale them down, you're going to start to notice a tile. Now maybe that isn't important for whatever texture you're dealing with, but if it is, we're going to need to make sure we have a tileable texture, which means there's not going to be any repeating section. It's kind of the first thing that sells that your model isn't textured appropriately is if we can see a seam or if we can see a repeat, because then it's not going to look realistic because that doesn't happen in real life. All right, so that's planar. Now, that's fine and dandy, but if I were to stand in front of the projector and keep this image, you know, projecting onto my face, you would notice that maybe it would look good on maybe my forehead, but as we round my cheeks, we're going to get some texture stretching, right? So I'm going to go into object mode, not UV mode. Sorry, my mouse is being... If I delete that, let's say I'll do a sphere. Okay, and I'll put on this one, my existing material. Now, if I go into UV and do a planar, you can see looks great, but as I go around, we're getting that stretch because it's just being projected from the top. So then it's stretching and then it's being projected from the bottom. So that's why we have some different options in our UV here. So we can do spherical, and spherical by default is set up to fit the sphere. Now you'll notice, once we get towards the top here, we're getting a seam and we get the points. That's because all of these faces meet in that one specific area. So remember, we talked earlier that we wanted all of our faces to be quads. This is what happens when you start to get into triangles and have several meeting at one vertice. So a lot of times you're going to have to play around and add a few different UVs to your object. So you might need to select these faces, do a planar, and adjust the scale there. When you're dealing with your shapes, yes, you've got some base shapes from your practice, but you're going to have a little bit more complicated in your milestone. So again, that's when we're going to have to break it down into what shapes did this come from. So let's do a cube. I'm just going to make some selections here. I probably am pulling from the bottom, which is totally fine, because you're going to have some random shapes. Now, your vertices won't be pulled in a sense where there's weird data like that because yours have been extruded, but for the sake of what we're doing, okay, so you can look at this and you can see on certain sides it looks great, but when it's pulled here, that's not what we want. So again, remembering why we tried to keep kind of a standard formatting to our faces. So now in Maya, we have automatic. So what automatic does, and you can see here, is it takes from a 6-plane view and shines onto your object. It's generally a good place to start unless you have a base shape, but it's going to need some cleaning up. So we can go into UVs and then our UV editor. So this is the next big step, whether you're in Max or Maya, when we're going to take a look at things. So here, this is to hide or show your texture, this little landscape looking icon. Here we can see this is the UV layout. So this is how it's taken that 3D shape and kind of unwrap it. Think of like a Christmas present, right? No matter what the shape is, generally we try to do a box because that's the easiest to wrap, but think about trying to wrap a basketball. You know, you're going to have some extra material at the top. You might have to break it a little bit differently. I'll show you, go back to that sphere just so you can see the base. I'll do a spherical. Then we can look at the UVs here. Now in here you can do the same move, rotate, and scale. I'm sorry, not move, rotate, and scale, but a zoom, pan, as we had done before. So here is our UV layout. You want your UVs to fit in one coordinate here. So that's when we can right mouse click and go into UVs, click and drag around everything, and you can see my vertices, they equal over here. I'm going to just select a few so we can see. The UVs are actually here, but I can move these and I'm not editing my shape. I'm just editing where the texture would be. Let's put this texture on here so we can see a little bit more. All right, so let's try and find what's in the front here. Okay, so again, if I'm just moving these, you can see I'm moving the texture, but I'm not changing the shape. So that's the difference between your UV and your vertice. Now, you can see I've got to fit it in this grid, and I would highly recommend that you look up model sheets and texture sheets to see when they take a full character and make it fit onto the grid. It's a really interesting thing to look at. So I would go into UV, I'll click and drag over the whole thing. I'm going to hit R for scale, so I can scale this down to fit in that quadrant. Then you can move it. If we were dealing with multiple UV layouts for a single object, you can make this as small as you want. Eventually, we're going to bring this into Photoshop and not have to deal with using a standard texture. We'll make the texture fit the object, not the other way around. So now you can see what we're dealing with here. There are a lot of things we can cut and sew, and if you want me to create another video to go over it, I totally can, but make sure you're playing with a bunch of these different options. Alright, so now let's take a look a little bit more at what the assignment is calling for. My mouse just wants to go straight for UVs. Here we go. So let's say again I've got my snowman. Okay, and I'm going to do a mesh combine. So now this is one shape. Now technically if you wanted to combine a shape, you'd want to remove this data that's in between where the spheres are overlapping, because these are faces that we don't need. You know, we're not going to see, it's inside. But for the sake of this, we can just go here, and then I can look and apply that texture that is in bright space. So I'm doing a blend, and then in my color tab, I'm going to grab that 3-1 image. Hit 6 if you don't see it on the keyboard, and now you can see what we're dealing with. So we've got some distortion, the top and bottom. So now is when we can start playing with our UVs and our UV options. So, you know, I started with some spheres, so let's see what these look like. So what you can also do, let me open up my UV editor so you can see what's going on at the same time. Here's by default what I have going on. I can also go into face mode and select specific faces, and I can do a UV spherical just on that. And I can do, you know, again, if I wanted to do a planar or whatever I wanted, I can do things separately. They don't all have to be done at once. So make sure you're thinking about your shapes when you're doing this. The ultimate goal is to have these little boxes be around the same size and as clean as possible. For example, if I go into object mode and I do a planar, I know we looked at this example already, but you can see these are not well laid out UVs. Now, why do we use the box with color and numbers? It's to help us see very clearly kind of like pixel information and the size and shape of them. Because when we go to apply a texture, you might not notice it right away, but you're going to get the same stretching where we're easily seeing it now. So I can try an automatic, and you can see here all of the different shells it made. So now I can right mouse click and hold and go into UV shell, and I can grab each of these as a whole. So I don't have to look at specific UVs, I can look at shells. But automatic tries to do its best to make the same size. But we're getting a little messy. I think I was better off with my spherical, and then I can always adjust from there. So I can go into face mode. I'll grab this, and I'll do spherical. And then I'll grab the top, and I will do another spherical. Okay, so we might need to clean up the top a little bit. You can play around with different types of mapping, again, adding a planar or something like that. If we look into our UV editor here, I'm going to go into shell mode. Don't forget that we want all of these to fit into this one grid section. So I need to grab all of this. And this information here is the inside. So can't see it selected because it's actually inside my shape. So that's why it was important to get rid of those. But for now, we will just select all of these and scale them down and make sure they fit inside my grid here. Okay, so this will make a nice layout. What you'll find is depending upon your shape, you'll have different sections. Again, we want it all to fit inside this grid, and then we're going to need to save it out. Now, of course, before we save it out, in the UV editor, I want you to be aware there are a lot of tools, because right now we've created seams, and you can see where the seams are based on the white lines. You want these seams to be in hidden places. It's really difficult, but try to think of what your object is and where your seams can be hidden, or if you can use a tiled texture. So a lot of times in humans, we use where the hair meets your skin on the back of your head. If a character has on a necklace or clothing around, the wrist, we try to hide seams there. But you can cut and sew to change where your seams are. There are a lot of different tools and modify options we have, so make sure you're playing around with those as well. But then we can go to Image, UV Snapshot. Then what you're going to do is give it a place to save. So for example, my desktop, you can call it whatever you want. I like to save it as a JPEG. And then you can keep the size pretty standard. It's in pixels. The edge color, because it's going to keep your wireframe, just kind of like in here, it's going to be white. And then you can hit apply and close. And then this snapshot will be what you'll need to submit with your Maya or Max file. All right, next we'll take a look at Max. All right, here we are in Max. So the base things that I talked about stay the same. I know you've got some online tutorials, but I just wanted to show you where to go to do the base kind of setup. So, got my standard primitive. Yours will have already been converted. We're going to go into our modifier list and scroll down. You can start typing it in, but it's going to be Unwrap Uvw. So once you have that in here, I'm going to go all the way to the top. Make sure we're making our selection, so you can click on it, grab it all. There we go. So now I can scroll down here and deal with which way do I want a projection. We've got similar ones like we did in Maya, planar, cylindrical, spherical, or box. So for example, I could do a planar. I can select which direction I want it to be aligned in, and we can do things that way. We have some options like your peel here, but if we scroll up, we've got edit UVs, and I can open up my UV editor. So very similar process as before. We want to fill this grid. We can still use our move, rotate, and scale. And we have all of our options on the side here. You can see we have peel here from before. We can stitch like we did before. So then we're going to go up here to Tools, and then all the way down to Render Uvw Template. Same kind of width and height in pixels here. Render target, we want default, just this one tile. And then render output, click the options, say where you want to save it. Save it, save as JPEG, and then save. We want it to be really easy for us to be able to use in Photoshop, so kind of a bigger file will work well. And then render Uvw template. Now because mine is just a square, you can see we've got this square layout. Yours will obviously be a little bit more complicated. Alright, so this can be done with any shape, of course, and yours will be a little bit edited. But I can create a sphere here, convert to an editable poly, go up here, start to type in Unwrap Uvw, can go to Unwrap Uvw, and then of course for this one we'll probably do more of a spherical map. We can look at the UV editor. So by default now you can see the edges, which are seams. This is going to be the top and the bottom, so you can see where it's green here. So if we were to save this one out, you'd be able to see all these different things. So just as a reminder, render, make sure to go to the output. I'll call this one test 2 just so you can see. Save it as a JPEG. Save. Yes, we'll overwrite it. So now you can see all of my UVs a little bit better. Okay, so pretty much the same in Max and Maya, and I'm just touching the basics, and we will get more into it as we go along. But feel free to let me know if you have any questions or you want to go over any of these additional tools.